I was born on May 8, 1924, in the most southern western part of Poland, in a town called Bilic in German and Bielsko in Polish. It went by both names. And it was in the province of Silesia, at the foothill of the Beskid mountain range. Well, you know, in retrospect, my parents seem absolutely saintly and everything seems just marvelous. I know it couldn't possibly be that way. I know it must have rained at times, but my memory is very vivid, and I cherish it very much, and I don't see why I should change this perfection which I remember. I had one older brother. He was 5 years older than I. His name was Arthur. My parents' name were Julius and Helene Weissmann. We lived in an old, large home outside of town with a huge garden with many fruit trees and flowers, a wonderful thing for children to roam in. I had 10 cats, all black. I knew all the names, and now, you know, my children, now my grandchildren are amused for me to recite the names of my cats. My brother had 2 dogs. I used to love swimming in summer, skiing in winter, and by and large, I think I had a marvelous childhood. I went to public school first, and then, but only until the war broke out, to a Catholic school called Notre Dame. It was a private girls' school. However, we had a rabbi coming giving us Jewish instructions. It was about, I would say, a quarter of the girls in my class were Jewish. And that was very much the thing to do. I really liked school very much, even though I pretended I didn't. And of course, you know, when the war came, that was the end of my formal education. Well, I guess the danger signals were flying very high in the summer of 1939. By and large, I must say, it was ignored by my family. I was away with my mother in a place called Krynica. I really remember my very first incident, which inspired a great deal of fear. My mother and I went to a concert, and I remember its setting quite vividly. There were flowers around. I'm not very musical, but something caught on that day, and I remember the crowd of people sitting there and flowers, and it was very warm. A day, you know, one of those golden days of summer, as I see it now. And suddenly, a young man came running up to the podium, and he pushed the conductor aside, and he said, "How can you all sit here listening to music when danger is coming from there?" And he pointed to the hills of which separated us from Czechoslovakia, which already had been occupied by the Nazis. And he said, "Monsters are coming from there. Why don't you go home and take up arms?" and so on. And I remember moving closer to my mother and saying, "Shouldn't we go home?" And but pretty soon police came and arrested the man because he was an agitator for disturbing the peace. But I still remember that sudden fear. And that really was my first memory of something impending. But we stayed perhaps another week. I don't remember exactly how long. However, on our way home, we saw on stations an awful lot of baggage, which was labeled Warsaw. Apparently people were going to Warsaw. And when we came home, my father had his arm in a sling. And my mother naturally was terribly concerned, and apparently he had suffered a slight heart attack. And unfortunately, and then things were moving very fast, that must have been perhaps the 3rd week in August, that we received a telegram from my uncle in Turkey. My mother had a brother. My mother only had one brother, and he lived in Turkey. And he sent us a telegram saying that we should get out, that we had visas which were in the embassy in Warsaw. But my mother said, we're not going to tell Papa about the telegram. Papa is ill and he should not be disturbed. And I guess that doomed my family. And I only hope and pray that my mother really didn't fully realize that. I remember it very well. I was 15, you see. It was Friday morning when we heard a lot of planes, and people ran into the streets and said, "So are German planes." And we ran out and saw planes with the swastika flying over. It was a terribly frightening thing, and a lot of activity started. And they were building trenches, and my mother tried to keep sort of the windows down or closed, and so from my father's bedroom. My father was in bed, and my father was quite ill. And that night, there were lots of refugees on the streets, people running away, and there was shooting. I remember one man was carrying a goat on his back. Apparently it was his only possession, a small goat. And people with wheelbarrows and in cars and everything. And my brother had a girlfriend, and apparently her family called and said that they are going to flee into the interior of Poland, and suggested that they would take my brother and me along. And my father insisted that that should be my brother's decision. I was, still considered too young to make a decision. My brother was 19 at the time. And my brother said, "No, we are not going to go. We will stay together. You need us." My father was ill. And that was a terrible shock, because, my father to me was sort of the center of my universe. I mean, when Papa decreed something, he could do anything. And that he should suddenly ask us, particularly my brother, to make a decision, such a momentous decision. I remember it was a terrible shock. And it was a very turbulent night. And then it ceased in the morning. And my father said to me that I should go, and apparently he wanted to talk to my mother and my brother, that I should not be around. And he said that I should call the family to see what everyone is doing, my father's brothers, and there were uncles and aunts and so on. And I went downstairs, and the ringing of the telephones, there was no answer. No one answered anywhere. And I remember suddenly it was like you were left in a world of the dead, all those homes that I remembered, and the phones were ringing and ringing incessantly. And there was no answer whatsoever. And when I came up, my father said, "No one answers today." And I said, "No." And then there was a wonderful Saturday. Everything was cut off. We had no electricity, there was no light, and it was a beautiful September day, flowers outside, and my parents were sort of joking. My father got dressed and came downstairs, and we were all sitting together, and that was really the last beautiful day. And then in the evening there was some shelling, and my brother went out to let his dog in, and when he came back he had a hole in his trouser, and he said they were shooting from the rooftops, that the Germans were coming. But we went to the basement with some other people, and it was morning. Then I don't remember those hours too well. But what I remember most vividly is that my mother called that we should come. She had prepared some breakfast. And we came upstairs, and we sat down. And suddenly, it was a tremendous roar, the roar of motorcycles. And it was a motorcycle with Nazis in it, with two. One in a sidecar and one sitting there. And my brother he had a wristwatch, but he had just taken it out of his pocket, apparently carried in his pocket. And I saw his hand sort of give down, and it was 9:10 in the morning. And I remember everybody just sat there totally stunned. And then we heard people running towards more cars, and more motorcycles were coming, and people were shouting "Heil Hitler!" And we saw from the house across the street the flag with the swastika was flying. And I think that was the most enormous shock, that people were prepared. Those were our neighbors, our friends. And they knew it in this very first hour. And to me, and of course, I can only see it in retrospect, and I've, of course, relived it many times. It was one of the things, it sort of changed suddenly. I remember a coal fell out from the grate of the fireplace, and it went on the carpet, and the carpet was sort of smoldering, and no one paid any attention to it. And I remember it had once happened before, how upset my mother was, and no one paid any attention. I mean, those were just tiny little vignettes which suddenly sort of, changed everything. And shortly thereafter, perhaps however more, then more and more trucks of soldiers were coming, and the voices grew more hoarse, people shouting Heil Hitler, and I saw a childhood friend of mine carrying white roses to the soldiers, and somebody all giving the soldiers schnapps, and the flowers falling to the floor. I mean, just the whole sort of thing. And I remember starting to cry. My brother dragged me on the carpet, and he said, "Keep quiet, you can't do that." And he took me up to bed, and he said, "Don't make a sound." And it was it was in the morning. I mean, the whole day sort of is a melange of many feelings, which I try to remember over the years. But one of the worst things happened that afternoon. The mother of a childhood friend of mine, she blessedly is alive, and she lives in Israel. Her name is Esther Bergman. Her mother came, and she asked where my father was, and she said, but she knew he was ill, but he said also to my brother that no man should go on the streets, because they had rounded up all the men that they could find, and they locked it in the temple, and they set the temple aflame. And then she sort of went out at the back door. And I think that was truly the first impact of what happened. I couldn't tell you day by day, People came, our neighbors came, our non-Jewish neighbors came. Oh, one thing, yes. A neighbor, see the home which we lived in. And not only was my brother born there, but my mother had been born there. It was a family home, and our grandmother had lived with us. Fortunately, blessedly for her, she died a year before the war broke out. She, never faced that. A woman came, and she asked where our flag was, the Polish flag, which used to be red and white. And my mother said, "Why?" And she said, "We have to make a German flag out of it." And my mother pretended to look for it in all places where she knew she wouldn't find it, And then the woman left, and she said she will be back later. Maybe my father can help look for it. And I think that became very clear, that we better produce it, because she really wanted it for our protection. And she said, all you have to do is, keep the red flag and cut a round circle from the white and put the black swastika on it. And she came to collect it, and she did it. And then she said she wanted to look where Arthur was, because he's very strong, he should hang it up. And he apparently could not be found to do it. So the woman struggled to hang the flag up, and she sort of said to my mother, if the flag is not displayed from here, it will be pretty obvious of who you are. And I remember we couldn't look out of the window to see that flying. We had some other people, living in our home as well, who were not Jewish, and some were sympathizers, and of course they wanted that, because this was the part which was German-speaking. Belitz before the war was Austria, and later on it was also one of the first things that became. They called it angegliedert zum Reich, Urdeutsch, so we were unfortunately not too far from Auschwitz, which was Oświęcim, and that became the Protektorat, the government, which was allegedly self-ruled. Of course, it wasn't, but we immediately became under the same rules as Germany. So the people who it was mostly German-speaking people, you see, and people were shouting, Heil Hitler, thank you for the liberation, and things like that, because they thought that, the Austrian Empire was coming back with, Franz Joseph and the beautiful Empress Elizabeth and so on, you know, because that part had been under Poland for only 20 years. So I think there was a lot of perhaps misguided feeling on behalf of the people, maybe not so much pro-Nazi at that particular point, but of course all that changed with time. That I can unfortunately tell you. Fairly soon, an order came that all young men between, I think, 16 and 50 had to register. My father at that point was about 50, and since he was ill, he did not have to register for a transport. My brother was 19. And of course, every day, you know, we knew that then that England and France declared war. You know, that we knew right away. That happened Sunday. You know, we were occupied Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, England and France declared war on Germany. Then, you know, most of the family had fled, our family. However, my father's sister, who had been separated from her husband and daughter in one of the trains which were bombed, came back with her son David, and she found her apartment occupied by other people, and she came to stay with us. David was about my brother's age. And David and Arthur, my brother, went to register to whatever they were going to do, and they said that they would be in some sort of labor battalion to build up what was destroyed by the war. The day was the 19th of October, on which my brother left. Anyway, just tell you one thing, my mother refused to make his bed for months. She wanted to keep the imprint of his head in the pillow. Well, things got worse from day to day. You know, we didn't hear from my brother for a long time, and when we finally did, which I believe was months later, he was blessedly in the Russian-occupied zone. He was in Lemberg. And what apparently happened was that they were brought into the interior of Poland near the River San. I don't know exactly what location. Pursued by bullets, those who were good swimmers swam across. He was a very good swimmer. And he was in Lemberg, Lvov, which was occupied by the Russians, and he worked there. My brother was trained in chemistry. And he worked in some sort of a factory making jam or whatever. I was one of the greatest, marvelous moments in the bleakness of our existence to hear that Arthur was alive. Again, I would have to refresh my memory in looking at some of the things which I have written after the war, which I have a more clear knowledge. It probably was a few months later that we were to move into the basement of our home. It was very wet there, and there was no electricity there. And my father's condition really deteriorated quite a bit. He suddenly looked very old. My mother, who up to that point, you see, because we had lived with my grandmother and so on, was rather pampered and, you know, given to be very easily discouraged and upset about little things like if, you know, a tablecloth didn't iron properly or the lace was wrong or something, showed incredible strength and fortitude. As a matter of fact, she was the one who did not cry when my brother left. And when my father wept, first time I saw my father crying. It was sort of a reversal of roles, you see. And I think to me a very devastating thing to see my father helpless, and I never saw my father helpless before. And so we lived in the basement. I learned new skills. I saw my mother bringing an old, it was called petroleum lamp, you know, lamp. And I learned to clean the chimney of the lamp, and we got some gas to have illumination like that because we had no light. And pretty soon, of course, you know, we exhausted our funds because we had no money. Also, things were very hard to come by, but where we lived, you know, there were vegetables and things were obtainable, and our neighbors, I had a nyanya, you know, nanny, who was wonderful to us, and she lived diagonally across the street, and she would go and get vegetables and bring things to us. But my mother was always a wonderful needlewoman. She could do wonderful things with her hands. So we sort of, through my nyanya, let word filter through that we would be knitting. And I learned to knit before the war, but I wasn't particularly interested in that. You know, I was more of a tomboy running around with cats and climbing trees. And I settled down, and we would start knitting sweaters for people. My mother really had a wonderful reputation, you know. She could embroider things on sweaters. She did some marvelous things. And we would be able to get candles. We had quite a store of candles because we couldn't use the lamp too often because no petroleum was available, you know, only limited things in our ration card. Pretty soon we got ration card, you know, with the name Jew, and there was very little to eat. And so my mother and I would knit for as long as daylight would allow. My father would sit and read to us. And really this is how my father was wonderful. And you see, I went to Polish schools, even though my first language was German. I spoke German at home. And whenever I would come home from school, I would switch it to German. But I couldn't read or write German. You know, I spoke it naturally. It was my first language. So my father unearthed my mother's books, and he started teaching me to read and write German. And then my father would read to us, you know, and we would let the candle go down, and we would take the wax, and my mother made little wicks, and we would put the candle on again, and we would knit. We got, I remember that very clearly, for knitting a sweater, intricate sweater. You know, at first I would just knit the sleeves and things, and my mother would do the intricate work. We would get 30 Reichsmarks. Well, even 30 Reichsmarks, if you could buy food on rations, was fine, but we had to start buying food on the black market. So I would say roughly a loaf of bread would cost 30 marks. So for knitting a sweater, we would be able to buy roughly a loaf of bread. And this is how things went. And then started the things of the Aussiedlung, you know, which was to be sent away. Every so often, a little card would come announcing that. As a matter of fact, the first one came when we had not heard from Arthur. And I remember at that point, my mother sort of must have suffered a nervous breakdown, at least a momentary lapse, because I remember she was totally out of things. She was calling for Arthur. She was in bed. And my father was up with her. My father told me to go and to pack. We were supposed to leave with 20 pounds of our belongings. And my father brought forth sort of 3 battered little suitcases, and he told me to pack some things. And word got around to in the community that we were selling things. Everybody, I mean, all the Jews, that was the way to do it. And people started to come. My father said, just whatever anybody gives you, take, and he stayed with my mother. And then word got around that if, I don't remember the exact amount, but say a kilo gold or something like that, it might have been less, it might have been more, I don't remember. If that would be given, then that would stay the Aussiedlung. So, you know, everybody scurried to give whatever jewelry people had to bring it. Of course, that was another ruse that the Germans did in order to get the valuables which people were holding and hoarding. And apparently they got whatever was needed for that purpose, because then a note came to say we could stay in unidentified, and that would happen roughly every 6-7 months. Again, I don't know exactly that, but shortly thereafter, we got, my mother seemed to bounce back and became her strong self, and from that time on, I would say, until the very end, my mother was absolutely a tower of strength. Looking back now, my mother was a very young woman at the time. She was 41 when the war broke out. Of course, to me, she was an old woman, to a 15-year-old girl, And my father was 10 years older than my mother. So the existence, went from worse to worse, and then this is how we roughly survived the first 3 years, 1939, till the spring of 1942. In the very, very early spring, it could have been March, perhaps, when the order came that we had to move to the Jewish ghetto, which was a shabby, remote part of our town, quite far away from where we had lived, because it was actually in Biala, you see. Bielitz, Biala, it's called now Bielsko-Biała, were twin cities. And we lived in Bielitz, and that was in Biala, and way out of Biala, near a very old cemetery, where we had to move. And as I told you, my garden held most of my wonderful childhood memories. And fairly soon, I would say probably in early 1940, there was a sign on it that no Jews or dogs were permitted in the garden. So we naturally did not go. But on the morning on which we were forced to leave our home, I jumped over the fence and went to the garden. And I ran around there. I remember it was the first violets, where we had a little brook at the end of the garden. There were the first violets were there, which I had picked, and I remember sort of climbing a branch of a tree where I used to sit and pretending what it would be like if nothing had happened. I would go in, my parents would be at breakfast, my brother would be going to school, and so on. And even so, I've always firmly believed that I'll go back home, which became the crutch through all the years. Looking back now, I realized that I must have had a premonition, because I remember that thing that I sort of really started imagining what my garden would look in all seasons, and I knew that I would not see it. But I don't know any longer if I thought that I would not see it for a period of time, or if there would be finality in it. I really don't know that. But you sort of take memories out like cameos and hold them and look at them. And that was it. Strange as it may seem, I guess I really was happier in the ghetto than at home, because I had friends there. At home I was, well, it isn't quite true. My father, there were several girls, particularly the one who became tremendously close to me, my friend Ilse. And there was Esther Bergman too, who lived not too far away, and she used to come. But my father would teach us, and that was still at home. He would take books out and teach us, and a bit of history and all the things that he knew. He was very knowledgeable. So, in a very fragmented way, but I think in those first 3 years, almost 3 years at home, particularly with my father, I think I acquired quite a bit of knowledge. He told me about his own thing. My father was supposed to be a rabbi, And because, you know, he came from, you see, my mother was born in Bielitz, which was very Austrian, and they prided themselves, you know. As a matter of fact, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, still celebrated Kaiser Franz Joseph, that's the Austrian Kaiser's birthday, which is on the 18th of August, which I still remember, you know, because, and I think they all talked about the good old days, you know, the waltz, and you know, everybody has to think the good old days. Well, my father's family came from a place called Chortkov, and Chortkov was the seat of the Chortkov Rebbe, which he was very well known. As a matter of fact, even now I read quite a bit. The name was Friedman. And my father's family was related to them, and I have some wonderful childhood memories as a child going to Chortkov. My friends, you know, there were a number of girls, and we all lived in the proximity, you know. In the ghetto there was one large building, and a number of my friends lived there. So it really was, in a way, a bit nicer for me, where, you know, of course there was a very sharp curfew, that I could never see my friends, like in the evenings or after 5 o'clock or what have you. Living in the same building was nice to see my friends, you know. And there was also some babies there, and I loved babies, and I could go and play with the 2 babies. So for me, in a way, it was a bit easier. It wasn't for very long. As a matter of fact, looking back, I realized how little time there was, because very soon an order came that we had to go and work in a shop, sort of a factory thing, sewing garments in a place called Wadowice. We went under guard to the train. The train station was not too far away, and we worked sewing garments there. And then my father had to go to fortify the river in Sucha. And that was very hard, because my father could really not bend his arm very well. But he started looking a little better. You see, he was very pale, of course, being home for so long. So actually being out in the fresh air, it was deceiving, but it seemed to me that Papa looked better. That was a very short time, really. Come to think of it, it probably was not more than 2 months. And then I remember my May, my 18th birthday. I was 15 when the war broke out, and I was 3 years, my 18th birthday. My mother decided I'm going to have a party. And I just had a wonderful thing. I just had a rather big birthday, my 65th. And a friend of mine who now lives in Detroit, my husband and children, gave me a party. She came to that party, and she was in Arizona now, and she was at that birthday party. The birthday party was rather grand, because my mother had some oatmeal, and she had made some wonderful cookies, which we all swore were absolutely tasted like nuts. And I had a birthday party, which was crowned by an incredible thing. I got an orange. I always loved oranges. Only later did I find out that my mother had gone out of the ghetto, sold a diamond and pearl ring to get me an orange. That was the last birthday gift from my parents. A couple of my friends were there. One lives in New York. And she reminded me of something not too terribly long ago, because the orders came on the 28th of June. All the men had to leave. It was a Sunday. My father amongst them. We went to the station. My father stood on the platform. He wore the yellow star. There is, however, one thing that I would like to mention It's a tribute to my parents. The last night before my father left, of course we all lived in one large room at that point. I heard my parents talking. I don't know if it was for them or for my benefit. They did not mention at all the parting in the morning, but they spoke about their years together. They were, about the happiness they have shared, about my brother's birth and mine, about the hopes they had for us. And I think in that they have instilled something in me which has been my legacy always. The value of the love, of the commitment, of the pride in who they were, and of the family. And when the going was rough, as it was in subsequent times, it was a very comforting thing, and I shall always be grateful for that. I mentioned seeing my father for the last time, and after that my friend Greta Marchfield, who lives in New York now, and I went. We knew they were taking all the men on Sunday, and the Aussiedlung took place on Monday morning. We decided, Gretel and I, that we knew what's going to happen to all the books, probably prayer books, and most of the books which were in Jewish families that were treasured. And after my father was taken away, we went and collected all the books. I was afraid that the Germans are going to use it for unspeakable purposes. And we dragged it to the Jewish cemetery, which was really on the premises of the ghetto. And we buried them there. I'm sorry for not understanding my mother's grief completely at that time. I was really terribly close to my father. And that I didn't comfort my mother that day. I think I sort of needed to be alone to lick my own wounds, so to speak. I'm sure that many people have given you the descriptions of the leaving one, of leaving. I guess ours was not too much different. Except that my mother decided to fast on that day. It was a Monday. And my mother fasted every Monday since my brother had left. And she had a bit of precious cocoa, which she had hoarded throughout the entire war for a special celebration. And she made that cocoa for me that morning. I must say it did not taste very sweet. We were marched through a town under the whips of the SS. There are certain reflections. I had it happen to me many times during the war, later on, that one sees sort of in rapid succession the things which you see and the things which it evokes. Like they were putting a new name of a movie on the marquee. Marching by a shop which sold fabrics, and remembering the type of fabric that my mother bought for a summer dress, but it wasn't color fast. It was such vignettes. It's very funny. I remembered them then, and I remember them now. Seeing some neighbor peering from behind the curtain, because you see, we went in from the ghetto through the town again to the other side of the town, to which was called the Sammelplatz, where we were. Okay. I marched with my mother. There stood a man with a cane. He asked me how old I was. I said 18. And he told me to go to the left. We were loaded on trucks sometime later, and I'd like to get this over with as fast as I can, okay? And I heard my mother's voice. I did. And she was calling, be strong. Bleib stark, she said. And I heard that I was in a truck. I jumped off. And I said, I want to go to my mother. The little man in a raincoat came by. His name was Marin. He came from Sosnowitz. I don't know how he had this enormous strength. He was quite short. It was raining. I was wearing a raincoat and a hat. And he took me bodily and he threw me back on the truck and he said, you are too young to die. So it was the man who probably sent my mother to her death. Decided I should not run back there. We went to a place called Sosnowitz. There was the Durchgangslager, which was a transit camp. The day was the 29th of June 1942, a Monday. There are long stories there, but I'll just confine it to my own. I had the opportunity of leaving there because of Abek, you know, sort of a boy who liked me. His parents tried to get me out of the Gulag. In my naivete then, I made a decision that I did not want to go out of the Gulag to go back to Belitz. There were 2 camps in Belitz. I mean, again, there's a story. There was a young man there who apparently liked me very much. His name was Abek Feigenblatt. He was a very fine artist. And his family suggested, he got in touch with his family, that you see, you could get out of the Gulag if you had a place of work, if you had some working permit, and that you could get out into. And he had 2 sisters, and they had 2 sewing machines, and they were willing to put one in a shop to secure a place for me, which was an incredible sacrifice. However, I knew that if I did that, I would probably have to marry Abek. I made the decision not to go. Maybe it is a good story to tell because I'm in awe now of the thought that I wanted to stay with my friends, even though I knew I was going to camp. Now, by strange and almost incredible coincidence, the man in the Gulag who came and told me that I was able to go out, his name is Jacob Schanzer. He now lives in Buffalo, New York, where, of course, I lived for so many years. That decision proved to be a decision which saved my life, because unfortunately, Abek's family, all of them, were deported and killed about 2 months later. And you see, Belitz, my hometown, was renowned for its textiles. It was called sort of the Manchester of Central Europe. They registered your name, your age, and the place you hailed from. And industrialists from all over Germany would come to buy slaves. A man by the name of Keller, I think it's good to use the names. His name was Director Keller from a firm called Kramster Meitner Frane. Kramster Meitner Frane had several spinning, weaving, and textile oriented in associated firms. And they needed people to work in the factories. When he came and he saw that X number of girls from Belitz were there, for some reason he thought we might have more dexterity in weaving or whatever. In any way, they were always looking, because you see that was still fairly early, that was 42. They needed German-speaking people to be trained. So he bought all of us for a place called Bolkenhain, which was a new weaving camp in Oberschlesien. And in fact, this is where we went. In all fairness, I must say that that camp was probably better than most of certainly what followed, because it was new. You see, we were only 50 girls there. And the person who became our Lagerführerin, at first sight she looked like a bulldog, and I thought she's going to tear us limb from limb. And she was a very kind person. She was probably chosen for her looks, but we all who were in captivity under her owe her a debt of gratitude. And I think by her very decency, she pinned a lie to the lips of all who said they had no choice. I won't say she particularly loved us. She saved my life once, for which I'll be eternally grateful. There was, as far as I know, and I do know, that as long as we were there, and later in a place called Landeshut, where she also was, nobody was sent to Auschwitz from our camp, from those two camps. And she showed that people could help individually, and she did. I only met, during my entire years under the Nazis for 6 years, I only met 2 who were really kind, and I think that they should be singled out for that. Her name was Frau Kügler, with an umlaut. So when we first saw her, and she barked and everything, I thought, this is the end of it all. Well, I was with my friend Ilse, whom I really would like to mention. And in the camp there we became as close as sisters. Ilse was a childhood friend only in the sense that her mother and my mother were friends, you know, but Ilse played the piano beautifully. She was exquisitely mannered. My mother always told me how I should try to be more like Ilse, you know, and of course I hated to play with her. She seemed to be the paragon of all virtue. And we became quite close already in the ghetto when we used to go to the cemetery. It was the only place you could go. But in the camps, you see, she had a little sister by the name of Kitty. And of course, Kitty was sent to Auschwitz. My other friend, Gretel, had a sister. So the 2 sisters, you know, everybody sort of had a buddy. And Ilse and I became that to each other. She showed great promise as a pianist. She was sent to Vienna about 2 years before the war to study at the conservatory there, and a great future was predicted for her. And Ilse sort of became my sister. Matter of fact, we looked quite a bit alike. And so it was, and there was something else that perhaps would give us sort of an inkling what it was like. On the train to the camp, to Bolkenhain, I met a wonderful girl, a vivid redhead, one of those, you know, what they call beautiful people, tall, a wonderful girl. Her name was Susi Kunz. She was born in Vienna, but her mother had died. She was quite young, and then she was sent to Czechoslovakia to live with her grandparents. Because you see, in that particular transport were mostly girls from Belitz and from Czechoslovakia. And, you know, we were all German-speaking, and this is why we went to that camp. And I was standing next to Susi on the train. You know, in the train sort of, there was a certain freedom there. You know, we were not confined yet in one. We were out of the Gulag and going someplace. And Susi said, we'll never, ever get out for where we are going. And I said, yes, we will. And I said, I'm sure the war will be over in less than a year. And Susi said, no, we're not going to make it. And I said, I bet you. And she said, okay. She said, let's bet for a quart of strawberries and a quart of whipped cream. And we shook hands on that. And Susie died on Liberation Morning. I found her dead. I don't know if she knew or if she didn't. She won that bet. Anyway, we came to Bolkenhain. Bolkenhain, you know, it's a terrible thing to say, but I think because we are recording that, all those things should be said. Actually, for me, it was easier then. Easier in terms that I didn't see my parents suffer. You know, I could sort of put things over there. I was convinced that my parents will survive, that they are someplace, that they're probably working. I pushed all sorts aside. And I was in a way liberated, in fact, that, you know, I wasn't worried that each of my action might spell danger to my parents. And, you know, I knew if somebody's going to beat me, they're not going to see it. All the indignities that wanted to suffer, and you know, and vice versa, you know. And of course, when you're 18 years old, you know, you have that resiliency, which you don't have later. Anyway, Bolkenhain was rough in terms until we mastered was what expected of us. There was somebody there by the name of Meister Zimmer. It was dreadful. And I used to amuse myself, and he told us all the things, you know, that we are going to be taught decency and all the things, you know, the very things that we knew so well, which obviously were designed to break our resistance, you know, and that if we behave ourselves and do the things, we can live there all our lives, you know. And I used to sort of speculate what he would look like when he's dead and things like that, you know. Fortunately, you know, I always wrote when I was a little girl and things like that. And I could lift myself from some of the things and do other things in my mind to remove that. And I think I did that in the very first weeks when we were there. But, you know, they used to stand with a watch, with a stopwatch, and you had to do Weberknoten, which are those very intricate, what do you call it? It's funny, I leapt into German now. To tie something, a knot, you know, a weaver's knot, to be exact. And you had to do X number a minute. And of course, you can imagine when you have somebody stand with a stopwatch above you to do that. Your life, but for some reason most of us were able to do it, and those who were not were put in the Spinnerei or in other things, so nobody was sent to Auschwitz from the original 50 there. And it was, by comparison of what came later, relatively easy in as much, I mean, we were not that hungry. We got some food because Mrs. Kiegler was decent. We worked in the factory long hours, and I think that was really the very best thing. You were so exhausted at the end of the day, and you had to concentrate so much at the work, you know, that your mind couldn't absorb all that. We were able to write letters, and again in that Mrs. Kiegler was quite generous, because I don't remember exactly, you know, what the ratio was, how often you were permitted to, but of course, you know, there were, who could you write to? But I was fortunate that I had my father's address in Sucha, which way my father allegedly was working on the fortification of that river. And I wrote to my father. I did not hear. Of course, I heard from Abek. Very often I wrote to him, and he started sending me letters as well as packages, which, again, through the type of person that Mrs. Kiegler was, those packages did arrive. I wrote to my father, and I waited to hear from my father. And one day, the most incredible thing happened. Mrs. Kiegler was out the mail, and she called my name. And I saw the letter. I jumped to get it. And then I realized it was the letter which I had written to my father. And on it it said, without forwarding address. I think that we needn't go into that. I only know one thing, that I lost my speech for a day and a night. I could not utter a sound. Anyway, we worked there, and the thing was, you see, the type of things that I don't know if it really comes across. It's a tremendous support system which existed in the camps. The love and the friendship and the sharing and caring and loyalties that people had for each other, that girls had for each other. You know, that was sort of the balance against the cruelty which we experienced. And to me, I feel that was probably one of the most important things that existed. And I somehow wish that would filter down. I usually to tell my children and now my grandchildren. Because, you know, they are the spiritual heirs of those who did not survive. To know that the legacy of the camps is not the legacy of the horror, but of the greatness of our people. The very humanity which existed there in the face of such incredible inhumanity. I particularly want to talk about my friend Ilse for a moment, but that actually happened in another camp. I'll give you the quick progression from camp to camp. We were in Bolkenhain, you know, we were working on looms, and pretty soon the raw materials started to disappear. We had to work on paper. There was paper that they were spinning, and of course, you know, in warm weather it became brittle and it would break, and in cold weather it would disintegrate because it got soft. And Schützenschlag was, you know, if those things tore the thing, which once happened to me, for that you could be sent to Auschwitz, but somehow Mrs. Kiegler intervened that people were not. And I remember at one time, which is what I wanted to talk about, Frau Kiegler, it was shortly after I received the news about my father that I became very ill. I don't know exactly what I had, but I know that all my fingernails started to have pus in it. You know, I couldn't touch my hands, and I was running a very high fever. And we had sort of a little, it was called Sanitätszimmer, in which people who were sick for a day or two could stay. And I was there. And all of a sudden, that Lindner, you know, I think he has quite a name in the SS, he came on a sudden inspection. And Frau Kiegler charged into the room. I omitted to say my father made me wear my skiing boots. I left home. I last saw my father on the 28th of June, and I left home on the 29th. So I was separated from my mother the following day. Before my father left, he said to me, "Wear your skiing boots." We were all avid skiers, you know, we lived in the Beskied Mountains. There was a lot of skiing there. And I said, "Why?" And my father said, "I want you to wear them." And I said, "Papa, skiing shoes in June, you know, I would have gone wearing a pair of sandals." And my father said, "You have to wear them." And you know, you didn't argue with your father in those days. I wore them, and I blessed them every single day, because I wore them for the entire 3 years that I was in camp. And in the lining, I had hidden the pictures which are now in my book. This is where the pictures were. At first, I was able to keep them in the first camp, but later on, on the death march, I had concealed them there. So Mrs. Kiegler charged in, and she dragged me out of the bunk. And she said, "Lindner is here. It's a matter of life and death. I'll take you to the factory." And she stooped down and she started to lace my boots. And she dragged me to the factory. She used to work in the factory before, and I worked on 4 looms. And she set the looms in motion, and she said to me, "Pull yourself together." And I remember I still felt the beating of the loom, you know, and everything was sort of at different angles because I was running a very high temperature. And he came for inspection, he went through, and if he would have found me dead, she could not have saved me. I mean, that was just no question about it. So that was Frau Kiegler. But pretty soon it became obvious that they needed us in another camp. And our camp was disbanded. And we went to, I think, 3 different ones. Merzdorf, Landeshut, and I really don't remember the third one. I was sent to Merzdorf. Merzdorf was a horrible, horrible camp. We were locked up on the 5th or 6th floor, and every morning they would wake us with whips. I worked in the flax detail, which was a dreadful place. They were doing linens there, and flax submerged in a swamp. So you had to pull it out of the swamp, you know. And then you opened the things and retracted the flax. It was terribly hot. It was in summer, and the mosquitoes were all over us when we were working there. And then I was singled out to do something else, namely to unload coal at night. Allegedly, I gave a fresh answer to one of the supervisors there, a man. And for that, I was banished to work in flax during the day and at the coal detail at night. It was an incredible time. Then I also to load the flax into sort of silos, which were, I mean, if I think now that there were 10 stories high, they probably were not. They probably were 3 or 4. But you know, you had almost no balance because those things. I remember that as nothing but torture, you know. As soon as we went back to camp, I was called to go on the wagons and unload coal. And that was there the only time. You know, my father had asked me earlier, I forgot to mention it, during the first Aussiedlung, when my mother was so ill, I remember standing at the window and we heard that a family had committed suicide together. And I remember standing at the window looking out at the garden, my mother being so sick, my father with his hand in the sling. We hadn't heard from Arthur, and you know, and I wished that my parents would suggest that. And my father and I were always very close, and he always knew what I was thinking. And I remember he came behind me and he said, without looking at me, and he said, "What you are thinking now is cowardly, it's wrong." He said, "Promise that you are never going to do that." I didn't answer him, and he took his hand and he turned my head toward him and he said, "I want your promise now." And I promised him. And I remember that during the working on the coal trucks, there were trains going by. I didn't know if they were going to Auschwitz or whatever. And I remember sort of the tracks beckoning in the moonlight. And I thought, you know, it would be over very quick, one jump and one pain, and that's going to be it, because it was so dreadful there. And at one moment, when I think I really came fairly close, I felt a very strange pain in my neck. Okay? Anyway, obviously I didn't do it. When things were really very, very hard in Merzdorf, we worked in the swamp one day. And I think that was really one of sort of my lowest hours. When, we had a Lagerführer in there who was the exact opposite of Mrs. Kiegler. She was maybe 18 years old, sort of overblown things, and she was wearing rings on every finger. And her great joy was to have a little wagon, like a child's wagon, and she had us pull her around in that wagon. She was having a whip about it. I mean, you can imagine the caliber of and the intelligence of that person. And all of a sudden, she came with somebody else, with a man, and they said, they were calling numbers. You see, we all had numbers, of course. And they were calling numbers. I was working next to Ilse, and I heard them call her number. And I sort of looked up, I must have been dazed, and she pointed and Lagerführer and said, "You idiots, don't you even know your own numbers?" And Ilse pointed to me and she said, "That is her number." And I didn't understand what she was doing. She obviously wanted to get me out from whatever it was. So the librarian came, naturally slapped me, and she said, "Don't you even know your own number, you idiot," and so on. And then they called my real number. And we didn't know what was happening, or maybe Ilse, I'm really not quite sure on that, but there was Director Keller from Bolkenhain. Also have an interesting thing to tell you about him. And Ilse fell to his feet, and she said, "My sister, you don't have her number," something like that. And he looked at me and he says, "I know you." He said, "You worked on 4 looms. You're coming along." They needed more people for working on looms in another camp called Landeshut. And this is how I got out of Madsdorf, and Ilse was on it too. And we got loaded on a truck, and we went to Landeshut, which was the sister camp. You see, Kramstermetenfahne, they had closed Bolkenhain, they opened Landeshut, Madsdorf, and one more, Hirschberg. And when we got there, who would be there but Frau Kügler was in charge of that camp. So that was like a homecoming. So this is how I had one incident with a Keller. He called me into his office once, and I just remember this most incredible thing. There was that huge, huge room, or at least to me it seemed huge, with a single carpet and a desk on it, and he sat alone at the desk. And what struck me is that probably in a room of that size, 50 of us slept. I think that at times like that. And he had a letter in his hand. And he said to me, "You have smuggled out a letter of the camp." Somebody. I said, "I never smuggled a letter." I said, "I've written some letters." And when I glanced over it, I saw that I had an uncle in Turkey who was in the textile business, because, most people from Belitz were in the textile, and my uncle. And I gathered that he knew my uncle because it was a letter later on. My uncle told me that he had written to him. My uncle had, when he found out in what camp I was, had written to Keller about that, because he had that thing. And Keller looked at me and he asked me a number of questions. Interesting thing was, apparently my uncle had sent a package, and that they encouraged me to write for more packages. The packages apparently contained chocolate and things which were not obtainable, which I never saw. They said the package must have been ripped up, but it looked in a very sturdy wooden box. But I was only too happy to write to my uncle that I received the packages, I was told, in very good order, because apparently they wanted those things. But this way I knew that my uncle was, I knew my uncle was safe, he was in Turkey, but that he knew where I was. Anyway, back to the thing, of course, we came to Landeshut, which was like heaven by comparison with Madsdorf. Only in Landeshut we then faced another difficulty, and that difficulty was that we worked the night shift only. So, we didn't see any light of day, except, if you got up during the day, you could. And we worked there for probably a year, or maybe even longer, on the night shift. But, Frau Kügler was there. Things got worse there because there was very little food, but she went on in the same vein as she was before. For instance, if somebody was ill, felt ill, there were not the things which happened in other camps, sent to Auschwitz, or beatings, or things like that. You got some sort of care or understanding, or things were covered for you a bit, as far as work was concerned. She tried to get vegetables. I don't know what rations there were, but whatever was so-called coming to us, and believe me, the things were laughable, but we got it. I remember, for instance, one thing that I always tell young people, they knew of the Jewish holidays, and there was one Yom Kippur, and they marched us out and told us about the holidays, and told that if anybody would be foolish enough to fast, that would be construed as sabotage, and sabotage was punishable by death, and everybody fasted. And we were given noodles and sugar, and nobody touched it. And I think, those are the things that I think future generations should know. And to me, that's what, and I remember then that night when we got our miserable smelling vegetables or whatever it was, there was such a feeling of sanctity, I think almost holiness. And they really jumped to try to see that we, if we didn't, everybody worked with, almost with such fervor and things that they couldn't fault us. And I think was such a oneness, I saw so much nobility of spirit in the camps, which somehow I wish would be better recorded. You know, when people reached out, you know, somebody had a birthday, so we would save, and Sunday we had margarine, a little margarine on the bread. So, you know, you would cut off some of the bread and scrape the margarine and give it to the person on the bread, that you would have a lot of margarine on a piece of bread. On Hanukkah, we knew it was Hanukkah, and that was still under Mrs. Kiegler, and she was busy celebrating Hanukkah and Christmas fell together. And, you know, she closed an eye to that sort of thing. We made a menorah out of potatoes. And, of course, we knew that, you know, we couldn't light the candle, but we made a menorah out of potatoes. And I still have the things which I wrote about, the story about Hanukkah, which we sang. I would like to translate it and give it to you. I had a wonder, if I may skip for 1 minute just to make a happier thing. When I went to Israel for the first time in 1961, my friend surprised me. I knew of 3 that were in Israel, but actually 10 showed up and I was the 11th. And they got out of the elevator in Tel Aviv, singing a song which we had written for the first Hanukkah in camp. And they carried a menorah, which I naturally have now, a beautiful old silver menorah that they gave me in memory of the menorah which we made out of the potatoes. And you know, when you made it out of potatoes, it meant you didn't eat that night because, you know, you didn't have potatoes. So you can imagine what that menorah means when my husband kindles the lights and we see our grandchildren reflected in that. It's truly even of survival. So, you know, that was possible under Frau Kügler. And one of the things that we did was Ilse and I dressed as grandmothers. And, you know, under the looms which we worked, there was sort of a white, powdery substance. We put it in our hair to be gray. And we had a performance between the bunks under one naked electric light. And see the faces in the bunks, you know. What we did is, it started out with, you know, we were 2 grandmothers, we were knitting, and kannst du dich erinnern, Ilse, oh, ich denk noch oft daran. That's how it started out. And then we, of course, predicted a brilliant future for everyone. And then our 2 granddaughters came to listen to us. Strangely enough, the person who played my granddaughter, her name is Fanny Steinhardt Goldschmidt. She lives in Israel. Her son was one of the heroes of the 6-Day War. Ilse never lived to have a grandchild, and the one that played her granddaughter also did not survive. But our granddaughters listened to our tale of the past. And I'll say it in German. The exit line on that was, komm, ich zeig dir meinen neuesten Filmstern. You understand German? Come and look, I'll show you my newest film star. Obviously, you know, one of the granddaughters says, Stern, okay? Denn die alten Leute übertreiben doch so gern, because old people exaggerate so much. And then we see them exiting. And I mind you, we were 18 years old at the time. And we say to each other, ach, liebe Kinder, sozusagen sei erlaubt, der Mensch hält mehr aus, als selber glaubt. Dear children, let us just say that the humans endure more than they think they could. And I think somehow, considering how young we were, we must have touched the core of our existence, the hope that someday to live in a world where our children and grandchildren will live, but best of all to live in such a climate where they will not believe our tales of the past. And that was possible under Frau Kügler. I mean, she didn't exactly hear the performance, you know, and we would sing songs in which we would say, you know, would make it probably sound like a summer camp there, you know, for her ears. And then we would throw in a few things in Polish, you know, which were exactly not meant for her ears. But by and large, that part, in contrast of course, you know, we were fortunate, quote unquote, that we were taken early yet, you know, before Auschwitz was in its full, for our parents, yes, but or the young people, because after that, People didn't go to working camps anymore. Landeshut was liquidated, and we went to the most miserable and bitter camp called Greenberg in Schlesien. Greenberg was an enormous camp. Its factory was one of the most beautiful in Germany, inasmuch that it boasted the most beautiful collection of roses surrounding the factory. It was in direct contradiction of the beauty that reigned within. I don't remember his name now. We called him Lalush. I will have to remember his name. He was the most brutal, sadistic. I don't know if he was director, but he was one of the people that he wore a signet ring on his hand, and he would jump like a cat and beat its victim until blood showed. Mostly beat the faces. And he would have a sort of a glazed look on his face. I don't know if I tried to suppress his real name. We called him Lalush. He was a beast. Things changed very drastically then. I still worked for very little time in the weaving factories, but pretty soon they had very little raw material for that, and I was moved into what was considered sentence of death, the Spinnerei, spinning factory. We were spinning fabrics, or rather threads, which came from raw materials, the raw material consisted of clothing, which came from Auschwitz. It came to a place called Krempel. Krempel are huge machines which sort of shred that. It was not difficult to imagine that some of the clothes belonged to our parents. I worked most of the time on the night shift there, and I remember whenever the horror of some of that became overwhelming, one, or at least I, played a game. Yeah, I perfected it, and that was to imagine my homecoming, with all the details being there, including the sort of things that we had long sold. The most dreaded thing in Greenberg was that, I'm not quite sure now if it was every 4 or every 6 weeks, we would go to a doctor's office to be x-rayed, because tuberculosis was rampant, and whoever displayed anything was immediately sent to Auschwitz. So you had a lease on life, usually for between 4 or 6 weeks. I don't remember now if it was 4 or 6 weeks. There was something there with those x-rays. I did a thing which I will always regret. The last day that I was with my brother, we had to go to the Kultusgemeinde, which was something like the Jewish Federation, you know, when he did his registering. And we, next to it were the ruins of the temple. And we climbed over the debris and we sat there for a moment. And one column, the eastern wall, stood undisturbed when everything else was in ruin. And Arthur picked up a little stone and he handed it to me and he said, just look at that column and always remember that our people will survive. And he gave me that stone. And I had made a little sack of it and I carried it on my neck. And when we went to have those x-rays, I took it off and I had it in my pocket. I don't know, it was later probably. I think it was on the death march that I lost it. And that would have been one thing that I would, the picture survived because I had them in my boot. But I had lost that piece of stone. Anyway, this was about Greenberg. Greenberg was a miserable camp with a lot of people being sent to Auschwitz. And then we knew that things were going bad with the war, because there were not bombings, but we had the sirens were blowing every so often, stopped working. There was no electricity, and they were going crazy, being vicious. Everybody there was incredibly bad. They made us stand outside for hours on a pell, you know. And if a piece of bread flew over the fence, which was once did, everybody was beaten to say who got it. I'm proud to say about our people that nobody gave away the culprit. We all knew who it was. And I think that this is what has troubled me so much, that I have read some of the accounts that people say how cruel people were, or how they stepped on each other, or they make it sound like it was like a snake pit, that people step for survival. Look, I don't know what happened in other camps. And this is why, I've always used my maiden name on everything that I've written and said. I would say that people behaved in the most incredible manner imaginable, by and large. And I think that this should be something that cannot be emphasized enough. It was in Greenberg that Ilse once found a raspberry in the gutter on the way to the factory. She carried it in her pocket all day long and presented it to me that night on a leaf which she plucked through the barbed wire, had washed it, and gave it to me as a present. I asked her to take a little bit of a bite, and she wouldn't. One single raspberry. Her total possession. She gave it to a friend. There were other acts like that. Many. That unfortunately are not recorded. And I think this is probably the greatest tragedy of them all. The nobility and the love that was there. Anyway, when things got really bad, when we sort of knew when things are going bad for the Germans, they're probably going to finish us. When things are going good for them, or well for them, I should say, they're not going to let us go on, or we will forever be slaves, So it was sort of a race what's going to happen. And that became obvious in January of 1945, where one day we were told we're not going to go to the factory any longer, to gather our meager belongings of whatever that was. The night between the 28th and 29th of January was a great commotion, and suddenly the doors opened, the camp, we were then about 2,000 girls. And an additional transport of 2,000 came from Auschwitz. They told us they had walked for I don't know how long from Auschwitz, and we were going to go on a march the following morning. Destination, later on we heard Oranienburg. Oranienburg was a murder camp also, smaller, not known, near Berlin, which fell into the hands of the Allies when General Eisenhower made that swift move on Berlin. And we started the march, now termed as a death march, 29th of January. I remember I had a terrible cold. I was coughing terribly. We were told to assemble in 4 abreast. It was Ilse, Susie, and Liesl. Liesl was probably the most beautiful girl I had ever seen. She moved like a deer. That huge brown eyes. It was wonderful. She and Susie were sort of like sisters, as Ilse was and I, but the 4 of us together. Liesl was from Stettin, from Czechoslovakia, and Susie was from Czechoslovakia, and Ilse and I from Bielitz, and the 4 of us sort of formed friendships, Liesl was the sort of, would look up and I would say, oh, it's raining today. You think I should wear my green raincoat? And she would say, no, wear the navy blue one. And, have you been to the garden to pick up apples yet? I mean, she would fall into any imaginary game. And I remember that morning very vividly. You know, there's such scenes in Dr. Zhivago when you see this incredible, almost like a wasteland of white. It was freshly covered snow. It had snowed during the night. And the whole thing in front of the camp at the factory was all covered with snow. And we were assembled, and they lifted their whips and forward march. And I remember Ilse said to me, she said, I don't know how you're going to make it. We'll all make it. And I was coughing so hard. And we started the first step, and I remember taking that step, and I remember saying to myself, this is the last chapter. But you know, I never had any doubt that we'll make it. And Ilse was to my left, Liesl next to me, and Susie on the extreme right. And I'm the only one left. I think the march is documented in, I'm sure, many other stories. It was unspeakable. I had my skiing boots. I was the best equipped because I had my boots. At first we still had a little bit to eat that we took along and hoarded. We marched, I don't know how many miles a day. We came to rest sometimes in a barn, not often. We stopped in a camp called Helmbrechts, where blessedly a few of our girls escaped. I didn't. People were shot continuously. If somebody stepped out of line, and then you would see snow being red. And there stood the forest, beautifully covered with snow, and birds chirped sometimes. And we're marching. Every day the number got smaller. And then we came to a place called Flossenburg. And in Flossenburg, Ilse was already very sick. Liesl, Susie and I were still going pretty strong. One time we had nothing to eat, so we started eating snow, which is a terrible thing to do. Because the more you eat, the more thirsty you are. And of course then diarrhea and all was rampant. When we left, then one time they put us outside. They would spray us with water, and then they would hurt us, literally hundreds into a small sink when everybody started to perspire, and they put us out again. And pneumonia was just like that. People died like flies. Then one morning we were told to assemble. We were going to leave the And I remember Ilse was frantic. She said, "That's going to be the end. I don't want to leave." And I said, "We're so much better off out and, in the open. Maybe we'll have a better chance." And all of a sudden came an incredible announcement that President Roosevelt died. Then I know it was true later on because, we reconstructed it time-wise, and it was. And jubilation broke out that all the enemies of the Führer will perish in such a manner. It was a horrible blow. It was horrible. But we found something that day which sort of compensated us a little for that. We found a wrapper of margarine. And there were still some little vestiges of margarine stuck to it. So we licked it dry. We thought we'll certainly get very strong. And things got very bad from then on. Ilse was really very, very bad. And one night we slept, and we used to sleep outside, and it started to snow, and sort of reminded me of the story, of the little match girls. And we went around and said, "Well, everybody, don't sleep, get up, because if you fall asleep and it started snowing, you'll never wake up." And some people said it's the best thing we can do is fall asleep like that. And then one night we came to an orchard, and before we came to that orchard, sort of something incredible happened. Oh yes, one time before that, because I saw Ilse was so sick, I said to her, we heard, and we saw a lot of people on the road already. There was an evacuation, and people were on wagons, sort of similar to when the war started, And we heard somebody talking in a similar dialect, German dialect, that we had. So we concocted a whole sort of story that we will run away on the next thing, and we will say that we, will take our stars off, and we will say that we were with our mother on the wagon, and we got lost, that we are from Mieles, because we had a similar dialect, and of course with names like Ilse and Gerda, it was pretty good. And we really had a whole thing how we are going to do it, and Liesel and Susie were doing something similar. And then we said our father was in the Wehrmacht, and in order to get the numbers, we felt very smart. We thought that if they interrogate us separately, we used our house numbers in 1939 when the war, got to make it a long number that, if they ask, so they will see that we told the truth. And we came into that little forest where we rested, and we sort of took a signal to each other that we are going to stay there when they say everybody assembles. And suddenly Ilse looked up at me and she said, "I'm afraid." And I was going to say, "Come on, And I didn't. And when we got out of the forest, they rounded up 14 girls, some of our best friends who were in the forest, and we saw them all being shot. So right then and there I decided, no matter what happens, I'm never going to run away. I'll go to the end, whatever the end is, but I'm not going to attempt to run away. Because we felt people were already running, and the Gestapo, the SS was not too much in charge, and, it would be okay. But we made a pact. Ilse and I said we're never going to run away. We were just saved by her, not by her saying we're not going to run. And it was either that day or the next day, I don't remember. An incredible thing happened. People ran into the streets and threw bread at us. And so we had bread. And that night we rested in an orchard. And it was snow. It was spring already. It was in April. I'm sure it was after President Roosevelt's death, so it must have been like maybe the third week in April. And I told Ilse to watch the bread, to hold on to it. She was really very funny already at this point. And my very dear friend Rita ran away, and she survived. She's in Detroit. That's quite a story I have to tell you about her, how we found each other after the war. And what we didn't realize was that we had crossed over to Czechoslovakia. And those were the Czech people who were throwing bread. And you see, if I would have known that out of state, because they would have hidden us, we would not be, because if you could make it and went to a barn or something, very often we saw the German farmers turn the girls over to be killed. It never happened in Czechoslovakia. The Czech people threw us things. And then there was a wagon and they threw something in. It landed and it was an egg. And I was sure that that egg is going to make Ilse well. We hadn't seen an egg in years and years. And Ilse didn't even feel like having it. And then one night, we were again out on the meadow, snowing and raining. And a very dear friend of mine, her name is Hanka, lives in Israel, came by and she brought 2 potatoes. I don't know where she found it. And I remember I devoured mine. I was so hungry. Then and Ilse had the other one, and Ilse said, "I'm not hungry." I just couldn't believe it. She wasn't hungry. She said to me, "You eat it." And I thought maybe she'll feel better later, so I kept it in me. And I said, "I'll hold it for you." And she said she was thirsty, and I went to try to get water for her. And an SS man came and kicked her. And she said, "Why?" And then I tried to catch some water in my hand for her. Then she said something incredible. She said, "I'm not angry at anyone. I hope no one is angry at me." And then she said to me, "You are going to survive." And she said, "If my parents survive, don't tell them how I died." And then she said something else. She said to me, "You have to promise me that you are going to go on for 1 more week." A week was a very long time. And she said, "Promise." And I said, "I'll try." And then daylight broke. And there were some blossoms on the trees. And I had gone earlier and I'd gotten a blossom for her to smell. And suddenly I saw that the blossom was all dead, probably from her fever. And when the sun got up, it was over for her. And we were told to bury the dead of that night. I couldn't do it. It's strange. I know she was buried because my friend told me under a tree. I remember the most minute details and places, names of cities and towns where we went through. And I cannot remember the name of the place where she died. I can't. And sometimes I wonder if perhaps it is so that every tree should sort of remind me of her. She's become over the years my alter ego, my young girlhood, my childhood. And every year on the 29th of April I sort of step back and see what that year had been for me. Been some incredible things that happened on the 29th in the past, how many years? 48 years? No, 45 she died. 29th of April 1945. I didn't see Susie and Liesel. I didn't know where they were, because at that point I couldn't walk very well myself. And I don't know now if it was a week later, a few days later, whatever. They really descended on us with tremendous vengeance, screaming it was all our fault because the Führer is tot, Hitler is dead. We felt if it was true, then either they're going to kill us now or maybe we will survive. It was, we came to a place in Czechoslovakia. Things were really quite crazy, you know. A lot of people were on the roads again, and soldiers running away, but we were still with the group. We had one woman SS with us and a couple of men. I don't know to how few our group had diminished enormously from thousands. It was a handful, maybe a little over 100. I think I was quite ill already, you know, because I was ill anyway and terribly upset about, you know, Hilda's death. And one evening we came to a rest. It was a place in Czechoslovakia. We went to Czechoslovakia at that point, of course. And that place was called Volary, which I only realized that later. We were sort of outside. It was quite quiet suddenly. And a truck came. We were going to go someplace, and my friend, and one of the SS women came and told Hanka, Keller, she's the one who's in Israel, to take off my boots. Apparently they wanted, she saw I had good boots, like my skiing boots. And Hanka said to me, come, I'll hide you. And she hid me behind somebody, and she pretended, you know, she never took him off. And then Hanka said to me, then a truck came, and the truck was going to take us someplace, I have no idea where. And she said, you better get on that truck so that she shouldn't see you. And I suddenly said to her, you know, I really want to stay here. I don't know what's going to, I'm in no hurry, you know, whatever. And it sort of was a feeling that it's probably going to happen now. They're going to kill us. And it was sort of, at that point, quite warm. After all the snow, you know, it was a balmy night. And I said to myself, well, I'm going to start thinking what it would be like on a night like that, being at home, being in the garden with my parents. So if they kill me, that's the memory I want. And the truck came, and some of our girls went on it. I didn't. We waited and waited and waited. The truck did not come back. Unfortunately, I heard that on that truck, there was one of the SS women who was pregnant, apparently. I didn't know that. And I don't know, they were shooting, and she was hurt, and one of the SS men then turned and killed 14 girls on that truck. 14? No, I think it was 14 before. You know, it's funny how you play with numbers. 14 or was it 20? I really don't know, but a goodly number of girls. And we stayed there, and they came back for us and took us into sort of a barrack or a hall or something like that. And they locked us up there. We heard a lot of commotion. There was shooting, and there were planes overhead and everything. And then the story had it that they attached a time bomb. It was strange. We just went, my husband and I, to a reunion of the 5th Division Medical Corps, who were our liberators, and they spoke about that bomb and how it was there. I mean, you know, for a while we thought, you know, maybe they just threatened it was a bomb or something, but apparently that was so. And they barricaded the doors with chains and things, and we sort of knew, they told us that we are going to be killed. But I think before that, there was some shooting. I remember shooting was going on. I was right here in my arm. Nothing happened, just little skin. And, at that point, I must confess that I'm not absolutely clear. I must have been quite ill already or whatever. But I remember sort of that night, it was quite turbulent. And I remember them curling up and sort of, the SS left, and they left their coats and things behind, and I sort of went and tried to sleep there. A lot of people were very ill. we knew the Americans were coming. I met 2 the night before, and then there was a crazy night. And in the morning, I asked Liesl. This was the biggest irony of them all. They were shooting from planes, and Susie was hit in her foot. Not Susie, Liesl. And she was lying there on the straw. And I asked her where Susie was. It was morning. And she told me that Susie went to try to find some water at the pump, and I went to look for her. And there she was, lying in the mud, and she was dead. And I didn't want to go back to tell Liesl that. So I went out. You see, I had seen, there were 2 Americans the night before. I spoke to them, sort of. But that is very vague to me. But I remember all the things of that morning. And that was after I found Susie, and I couldn't tell Liesl. So I went outside, and I stood sort of in the doorway. It was a brilliant morning. Oh yes, I have to tell you what happened tonight. I saw that morning on the steeple of a church a homemade white flag of peace. And I remember that was the first time I cried in many, many months. It was sort of a strange thing that I remember that my tears, it's funny because now I cry at the slightest provocation. I cry when I see a dog or a cat or something like that, but I didn't cry for many years. And I was standing there and all of a sudden I saw a strange car coming down the hill. No longer green, not bearing the swastika, but a white star. It was sort of a mud-splattered vehicle, but I've never seen a star brighter in my life. And 2 men sort of jumped out, came running toward us, and one came toward where I stood. He was wearing battle gear. I had to think, his helmet was mesh over that. And he was wearing dark glasses. And he spoke to me in German. And he said, "Does anybody here speak German or English?" And I said, "I speak German." And I felt that I had to tell him we are Jewish. I didn't know if he would know what the star means or anything, but And I looked at him. I was a little afraid to tell him that, but I said to him, "We are Jewish, He didn't answer me for quite a while. And then his own voice was sort of betrayed his own emotion. And he said, "So am I." I will say it was the greatest hour of my life. And then he asked an incredible question. He said, "May I see the other ladies?" What we have been addressed for 6 years. And to hear this man, he looked to me like a young god. I have to tell you, I weighed 68 pounds. My hair was white. And you can imagine I hadn't had a bath in years. And this creature asked for the other ladies. And I told him that most of the girls were inside, they were too ill to walk. And he said, "Won't you come with me?" And I said, "Sure." But I didn't know what he meant. He held the door open for me and let me precede him. And in that gesture, he restored me to humanity. And that young American of that day is my husband. I was very ill after that. They established a hospital. I was in the hospital for quite a while. I was told I was going to die. Liesl unfortunately died a few days later of the wounds which she sustained. I was in the hospital for quite a long time. He asked me if he could do something for me, and I said if he could write to my uncle in Turkey and tell him I was alive, and to see if he had any news about my parents and my brother. And I didn't see him for quite a long time. You see, the following day the war was over too. And how I found out about it, then we went to, they made a hospital out of a schoolhouse. We were married a year later in France. My husband came back, had to be discharged from the army. He came back. We were married in Paris, and I came with him to the United States. I landed here on the 30th of August, 1946, came to Buffalo, New York on the 13th of September. I have 3 children and 8 grandchildren. I have 1 minute to make one statement. I wrote in a preface of my first book something which is very dear to me. It goes like that. As I finish the last chapter of my book, I feel at peace at last. I have discharged a burden and paid a debt to many nameless heroes, resting in their unmarked graves. I'm haunted by the thought that I might be the only one left to tell their story. Happy in my new life, I have penned the last sentence of my past. I have written my story with tears and with love, and in the hope that my children, safely asleep in their cribs, should not awaken from a nightmare and find it to be reality. I have just put my youngest grandchild, 3 weeks old, into her crib. It is with this prayer in my heart for all children everywhere that I hope the world will remember all children.